Cumulative causation. So, this is one of the theories about human migration. This helps us understand how so much migration can happen and how it gathers its own kind of momentum. In fact, when I used to teach this course on campus, I used to define cumulative cumulative causation as just migration causes more migration and explain why that so often is the case. And some of that we saw already, the migration networks, that they kind of build momentum as more and more knowledge is shared between people, and these social networks are far reaching, and eventually large parts of communities can migrate out. Well, cumulative causation includes a little bit of that, but it includes a lot larger set of factors as well that makes international migration sustain itself in ways that make even more movement progressively more likely over time. If you look over here on the left side, that's essentially our bold print definition. So there's a number of things that happen along the way that make this occur. And this the first time I ran across this, I just found this so fascinating. And I'm really glad that I'm doing these screencasts now so I can talk with my notes about you, because I've taught this class for so many years. Only once in the last 10 years have I taught in person, and it's mainly because we get it better enrolled. But I really love talking about this stuff. And it really is fascinating. Students have always found this to be very fascinating. So the first thing that we'll talk about is distribution of income. So what we see is just kind of come over here, and I'm just going to walk through some of this with you, okay? Um, People migrate for a number of reasons, and one of them is that they want to improve their income relative to other households in the reference group. So if people think about us, as in our social group, people like me or people like us, then when we compare other households that are kind of like us, we can, after migration happens for a while, um, it can make more happen. Here's how it can work. Very commonly in working class communities in middle and poor income, low income countries, when you go into small rural communities, almost everybody's poor, very small middle class, a few very wealthy people, landowners, a few other local businesses, and so on. But pretty much it's working class people, right? So, in this sense, there isn't a huge amount of inequality. Most people are poor. But imagine after some people migrate out and they work for a few years, and some of them start coming home with nice fancy vehicles they could never have ever purchased with local wages. How do they do that, right? So of course the word gets out and people see what happens. And so if someone in your, let's say you went to elementary school with neighbors, cousins, or whatever, and you're all part of the same kind of working class social group, for example, and Uncle Ned's he migrates north, and now his family, they have all these things that your family doesn't, and so you see that and you feel like you're getting left behind. You want to catch up, right? And so this is relative deprivation when you feel you're falling behind. And so what happens then is the distribution of income starts out pretty even, mostly working class. Then it becomes somewhat unequal as some people migrate out, and increasingly unequal for a while as more and more people migrate. But then when migration is has really affected a very large part of the community, then the inequality falls again. So during that time period when there's a very sharply increasing uh, income inequality because of migration, it will create the conditions for even more because other people don't want to be left behind. They want to catch up. And imagine it this way: there's an old saying, uh, pobre la que no tiene esposo trabajando en los Estados Unidos. And what that means is, we would feel sorry for someone who doesn't have a spot. I said this backwards, by the way. I should have started. I'm sorry. Let me start over. The poor person is someone who has to be all alone, and is because their spouse is working in the United States. So you feel sorry for them. But after this becomes more and more common, people realize, no, you feel sorry for yourself for being poor if your husband isn't working or your boyfriend isn't working in the United States. And so That's how that kind of changes through time. Um, so the distribution of income. So again, for a while, as it gets very, very unequal, it has a huge incentive for people migrating out. The second one, looking off to the left, is the distribution of and concentration of land. Now that's the next one in the order as well on this sheet off to the right here, and you're reading distribution of land. So what happens? People tend to buy land as a kind of prestige thing and as a good investment. After all, they're not making any more of it, right? And early migrants who buy land uh, do so anticipating that more migration might cause increases in land prices locally, and so their land will be more valuable later. And very often they're right; that does happen. And so when people learn that, then even more demand for the land happens, and you would be amazed at the price of land in communities in rural Mexico. And the state of Guanajuato, I've seen that operate in some communities outside of the city of Irapuato. It's just amazing how expensive the land really is. Uh, and so what happens then is it's held for prestige or for it just as a way of a kind of an inflation hedge, that sort of thing. But it's not so much held to farm anymore. So what might have been valuable farmland now, well, you hold it. You're working in the north. What do you do with the land? You might not farm it at all, or you might allow some local person to have their some of their livestock graze it, or something like this, right? And so, if you're no longer farming, say, the traditional crop like corn on it, then there's not as much demand for labor on the land. It's something we mentioned a little bit earlier on in the term about sorghum. So you plant sorghum now, which is a livestock feed, instead of corn, and the sorghum is heavily mechanized. What happens then? Not very many jobs are created when you're growing sorghum compared with corn, and so there's less demand for labor locally. So local wages get even worse, and people are even more likely than ever to leave. There's just no jobs, and the jobs that are there, the wages are terrible. So that puts more pressure on people to leave. So, and ironically, then by migrating out and then later buying land with some of the dollars, it causes even more migration out because jobs disappear, and the funding or the wages for the few jobs that remain sometimes is even suppressed more because of that. So you get this kind of happening, and what I described as well is really integrated with the organization of agricultural production, as I described, a more mechanized and more chemical intensive farming operation means less labor demand, and so less labor means less jobs. So people would leave, right? So that's kind of how agriculture, looking off the left here, how agriculture is done. The next one is culture. So there's all kinds of things that happen in all of this, and some of it relates a little bit to the relative deprivation in number one. These are related. Okay, so the first one is that there's the materially successful migrant who is a consumer, right? So you can't really be much of a consumer if you're working locally and wages are, say, $4 a day or something, right? I mean, you're basically getting enough food to eat and a little more, maybe. That's about it. But if you're in the north and you happen to have had some good work, it's unimaginable how much better off a person is financially, even after all the expenses of migrating and so on. So this has been a factor where just the successful migrant consumerism, when they see those lifestyles, they see what can be bought and so on, they become more, people will more likely say, well, the only way we're going to get those goods is to leave. And one of the things that will happen too is that there's a kind of selection process here. So looking back off here, I skipped one, but it's a rite of passage for young males. So if you want to prove yourself, if you're from a working class community, that you're ambitious, you want to make some of your life, you want to attract some of the more interesting young females to be your significant other, your spouse, migrating north proves that you are a hard worker and therefore merit consideration. And there's no end to little ads in local newspapers during the holiday season. In the old days, especially when people used to return more often in Mexico, people would run little ads saying, Radico en los Estados Unidos, busco una esposa. I live in the United States and I'm home now. I'm looking for a wife. And so they would run ads, and literally working in the north was a good thing. and still remains that way today. Although I see less of those ads now because there's not as much back and forth migration. That's a whole other story. So what happens here is that becomes a rite of passage for young males, and of course you want to be highly regarded and to be a good catch, so you become a migrant. And some people who stay behind, who are also in your class, are considered lazy and maybe not so worthwhile to pursue. So you have that kind of process happening that changes the sort of values and aspiration products of the local culture, looking off the left side here. Um, so another one is just and I could have done this before the rite of passage, but just migration is a normal process. That's what we do. Our family is migrants. We work in the north. This is life. So it becomes normal and it's expected just because of that alone, even aside from the sort of rite of passage thing that goes on, right? And so that's part of the story as well. And an interesting one, and some more recent scholars have done some really great work on this. Migrant women gain greater power and influence through their contributions to household income. I did some work on this, published with a couple of people up at Portland State uh, about a little over a decade ago now, where we were looking at that question. And what we found was that in the sort of traditional household where he works and brings money home, and then she's the homemaker, the mother, and so on, that's how it's always been, right? But a lot of times, when a woman, for whatever reasons, enters the labor force, now she also has another role to play. And a lot of times the men don't like it. A lot of them don't want their wives to work because then they don't need them so much anymore. I'm the breadwinner, and you just need to stay home with the kids and be a good spouse and so on, be a good cook and make me good meals. And so these are very traditional models of life. And I'm not taking sides or critiquing. I'm simply saying this is how these are some things that have changed. So women can gain greater power and influence because they earn wages now, have more say in the finances of the house and so on, instead of just taking whatever money he brings home. And so, but this also can create a lot of stressors and conflict. And sometimes men will even try to control their wives even more when they try to work, or they'll call them at work, or they'll pester them, they'll monitor them, and so on. And so, this is some of the stuff we did research on. So these are the kind of challenging the traditional way of thinking about the role of a woman here. And it doesn't always mean that women are better off, though sometimes they end up being better because of this. So you have that in communities. And this has been studied in a number of different continents. This is not something unique to migration to the United States at all, at all. So you have that kind of dynamic then, and so these are all part of the culture and values aspirations. What I want to look at now briefly is the regional distribution of human capital. And sometimes what can happen is when there's more migration out, there's a better tax base, and so more people become more highly educated. But guess what? The returns to their own education are higher now, makes them more likely to migrate out because they have more ambitions now, because they have maybe a high school education, something like this. And so as more and more people in these smaller towns migrate out, that can continue to change things. But definitely there's a push factor. If they do become more educated, they have more ambitions too, and more possibilities of something besides either rural labor there in the town, or maybe in a nearby city. And then finally, the social meaning of work and social labeling is really important in this as well. And what that is often is what we call social labeling. And what happens, this is especially true in receiving countries. There's certain kinds of jobs that just become immigrant labor. Oh, that's the jobs that immigrants do, right? We don't do those jobs if you're, say, a native of the country. And so once work gets identified that way, people who are not immigrants and not from the social group of immigrants either, or the nationalities, they are less likely than ever to want to do that work because that's work that immigrants do. So it loses prestige for local workers. And farm labor often, of course, is one of the most common, but there are many, many others. Can you think of some others, right? And so these are just a few of the factors here that change and make migration more possible. Unrealistic expectations. Sometimes people think they're going to do better than they do. And then there's the whole migration industry. Wow, I'm going to have to do that on another slide because I'm running out of time. So we'll check that out in a bit. I'm going to pick up the migration industry later. We won't do a video on it right away. So stay tuned for another week.